1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had fallen and was in the hospital. They were worried and they thought, let's call the police. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters. He has been bludgeoned to death. And they realized how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized. Nothing in the house was stolen. And Phil himself didn't have any enemies. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever was in there with Phil must have known Phil. What would motivate some person in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime? There was virtually no evidence, with the exception of the murder weapon, this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it had taken the time to wipe it off. For months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow. She's alone in the Peters residence, and she hears the tapping, and it's coming from the kitchen. On the other side of the kitchen was a door. She said it was slowly opening, and out from behind comes this white hand that reaches for the side of the door and begins to pull it open, and she screams, and the hand retracts back, and then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around before going silent again. The police go to the house, and they're looking all through the house, and there's nothing. The housekeeper didn't go back, and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital. At this point, the police decide, we're going to permanently stake out this house. 2 detectives go, and for a couple of days, they're not seeing anything, and they decide to just go inside and have a look around. And as they're standing on the first floor, they hear a doorknob turning upstairs. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, he sees a foot dart into a little space, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. They both grab this person, and they yank this person out. He was super tall, but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times. As it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his friend Phil Peters. But when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there, and Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. He noticed when he was looking through the house that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. He decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, get a bite to eat, then go back up to his little space. About a month later, Conies leaves his little spot. He gets to the kitchen. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him. In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. He wipes off the murder weapon. He goes right back up to where he lives. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence, he says, now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years. 1946, 5 members of the Van Ulst family arrived at the Devil's Den State Park in western Arkansas to spend a week in a cabin. After getting unpacked, the father, along with his daughter, who was 8 years old, named Catherine, and her 2 older brothers, they headed down this creek that led up to the side of a dam. Catherine and her 2 brothers jumped in the water, and their father just sat on the edge to watch. The swimming area had one really deep section that you were allowed to swim in, but the kids that were not strong swimmers tended to stay away from, and Catherine was not a great swimmer, and at one point she kind of drifted into the deep section, and her father didn't notice, but a woman who was staying at the campground, who the family didn't know, saw Catherine struggling. She reached in and pulled her out. Catherine was fine, and the woman told her, you gotta be more careful, and Catherine said, okay. Catherine's father sees his daughter talking to some stranger, waves in their direction, and the woman, she sees this, and she must have been a mother herself. She picked up on his uncomfortability, turns to him and says, everything is totally fine, I was just helping your daughter get out. Catherine's father turns to his daughter and says, gotta be more careful, don't go in the deep end, and Catherine's like, okay. Catherine walks to the backside of the dam, because this dam, it was a gradual slope of these big boulders that the kids at this campground would climb all over, and their parents would watch them next to the swimming area. Catherine's father was watching his 2 sons, and then he'd look over and watch Catherine, but at some point when he was looking at his sons, he looked back at Catherine and she was gone. He's looking all around and he's thinking to himself, I just saw her seconds ago. Before long, Catherine's father is screaming for Catherine. He's enlisted the help of everybody at this campground, and there's no sign of this girl. After about an hour of looking, Catherine's father went and got police. For 2 days of searching the very thick forest and finding no trace of Catherine, authorities decided it was far more likely she had drowned and began draining these 2 sections of water to see if her body would be at the bottom. But she wasn't there. On June 22nd, 6 days after Catherine went missing, a group of searchers were located 7 miles into the forest. They were walking up this mountain and they're yelling Catherine's name. time, and they stop when this little girl wearing only a bathing suit walks out of a cave, looks down at them, and just says, "Here I am." The searchers couldn't believe it. It was Catherine. She was reunited with her family. They brought her to the hospital, and 2 days later, she was discharged. This 8-year-old, who's never spent any time in the woods before, survives for 6 days and 6 nights with only a bathing suit on. Despite there being no potable water, she was determined to be relatively well hydrated and had only lost a couple of pounds. So rescuers believe the minimum real distance she would have covered to get up to that cave was about 30 miles, and she did it barefoot. When authorities asked her, "How did you do this?" she said, "I don't know. I don't remember how I got lost. I only remember sleeping on warm grass." Her next memory is waking up inside of a cave on day 6. She has no idea what happened between day 1 and day 6. While some say this is just a really weird case, others think there was something in the forest that chased her, forcing her to run, and because it was so traumatic, she forgot the experience. But like all of the missing 411 stories, we have a lot more questions than answers. 23-year-old Dakota James was out bar hopping in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with some buddies. At some point, he was tired, and so he decided to walk home. A CCTV camera has a clear shot of Dakota James after he left the bar, walking through a plaza. He's on his phone. No one seems to be following him. He seems like he's okay. He's not stumbling as he makes his way home. The next day, when he didn't show up for work, that was so out of character for him that his work immediately called the police, notified his parents, and this massive search is launched. But unfortunately, nothing turns up. 40 days after he had gone missing, his body was found in the Ohio River 10 miles away from where he had been missing. And the general theory became, when he was walking home after that CCTV camera picked him up, he must have stopped by the water to relieve himself, fell in. The water was so cold at the time that he would have gone into shock and then basically been doomed. And then he drifted 10 miles to this location. But there's a couple big issues with that. Number one, in order to get from where he went missing to where he wound up, he would have had to go through this dam. And the dam is this very violent section of water where if a body were to go through there, it would get ripped to pieces. But when they found his body, it was clear he had not gone through a dam. In fact, his body was pristine. It looked like he hadn't been in the water for very long at all, despite 40 days elapsing since he had gone missing. When his toxicology report came back, he had alcohol in his system as well as a high level of GHB, which is a very powerful sedative. And like you'll see in many of these cases, he had no water in his lungs. But this was ruled an accidental drowning. The family was unwilling to accept that as a cause of death, so they went out and hired a world-renowned forensic pathologist named Dr. Wecht to come in and analyze all of the evidence, look at the autopsy report, and try to see if there's anything that was missed. And what Dr. Wecht finds is on Dakota's neck, there were ligature marks, as if rope or some sort of twine had been wrapped around his neck, which was later disputed by the other medical examiner who said that was dried blood. But Dr. Wecht swears there was ligature marks on his neck. Dr. Wecht also concluded that there was absolutely no way, based on decomposition levels, that Dakota was in the water for more than a couple of days. And he believed that he was dead or unconscious when he actually went into the water, which is why there was no water in his lungs. So it begs the question, if we believe Dr. Wecht, where was Dakota from the day he went missing until 37 days later when he apparently went into the water? And again, why are we calling this an accidental drowning when he didn't drown? January 6th, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, who was a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, arrived at the Denver airport. Harold was running late because his commute into the airport had been treacherous because Denver and the surrounding areas were all getting pounded by a snowstorm. He made it to his gate right as they were boarding the plane. So as the plane began to lift off the ground, he watched as the city lights of Denver slowly faded away. But just before their plane entered into the thick cloud that was hovering over that stretch of Colorado, located just west of Jefferson County, which is where Harold worked, was a 22-mile stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Guanella Pass, and it took motorists up and over this 11,000-foot mountain pass. This road was not maintained in the wintertime, so if there was snow on the ground, you simply could not get through this pass. It was impossible. He saw there were clearly a car's headlights on the Guanella Pass. Whoever was in this vehicle was holding a flashlight out of their window, and they were shining the light straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off, signaling distress. So Harold knew if he didn't act quickly, this motorist was doomed. And he waved down the attendant, and then after the attendant ran over, Harold explained who he was, was and why his experience as a sheriff told him that this was an emergency. The pilots used their radios to call down to authorities on the ground, and then just a couple of minutes later, the fire department was dispatched to Guanella Pass. 15 minutes later, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, he sees up ahead the headlights of the stranded vehicle, which was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and gotten stuck in a big snowbank. And inside was a terrified-looking 30-year-old man named Alan Phillips. It was the middle of the night. It's negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Alan only had on a light jacket and some jeans and a small blanket wrapped around him. Alan began crying tears of joy and thanking God that he was going to survive. Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, told Dave that he had gone out drinking at a bar. He had stupidly decided to drive through the Guanella Pass back to his home. Over the next few days, local newspapers in Colorado and some national newspapers ran headlines about the miracle at Guanella Pass. 38 years later, in 2020, it was discovered that Alan had lied to Dave about why he was in Guanella Pass. He had murdered 2 hitchhikers near Breckenridge, Colorado. DNA evidence connected Alan to both cases. The only reason Alan got stuck in Guanella Pass is because he was attempting to flee the area where he committed these murders. In February of 2021, Alan, who was 70 years old at the time and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for these 2 murders, and he is currently awaiting trial. Summer of 2015, a young man named Paul was on his last day of a 7-day solo backpacking trip through a very remote area in Utah called the Dark Canyon Wilderness. It's an area that's only accessible by foot, and it's not uncommon to go in there and not see another person the whole time you're there. That morning, Paul got up and set off on a day hike that would take him through a very forested area up onto a plateau where he planned to camp out for the night. He found some amazing elk antlers and he decided he wanted to keep them. He threw them on his backpack and rested them at the top and continued on his hike. But the added 15 pounds of weight proved to be far more exhausting than he was anticipating, and very quickly he blew through all of his water. He needed to find water. So he puts his pack down, he puts the elk antlers down, and he starts walking around, and amazingly, he does find some water. And as he's preparing a fire to boil this standing water, he figures, if I'm making a fire here, I might as well just make my camp here. When he realizes how dumb he's being. If there's a puddle of standing water right here, probably just a little ways upstream, there's going to be some running water. Why don't I not boil this crappy water that will only yield a couple sips of water and go look for the running water where I can drink as much as I want? And he leaves all of his gear at the campsite and he begins walking up this mountain to hopefully find a stream. And after about a half mile of walking up this mountain, he finds this little spring, and he realized he left all of his gear, including his water bottles, at camp. So he gets up and he turns around and he starts walking back towards his camp. And immediately he starts to feel really anxious as he's walking back. He can't help but feel like someone's behind him watching him. Every little sound he hears is totally throwing him off. He finally gets back to camp, he gets his water bottles, and he considered not going back to the spring because he didn't want to cover that distance again, but ultimately he knows he needs the water. He grabs a really big stick to use as a club, and immediately as he begins that half-mile trek to the spring, the anxiety pours right back over him and he can't help but feel like someone is watching him. But he gets up to the spring, he fills his water bottles, he turns around and he starts walking back and lands on the trail he had just been on a minute ago, and he stops because he sees something on the ground that wasn't there before. A fresh mountain lion print is placed right in between 2 of his footprints that he had just made on his way back to the spring, meaning there's a mountain lion somewhere right around here that's not just watching me, it's hunting me. Runs to his campsite and gets in his tent and huddles in his tent for the rest of the night, hoping a mountain lion doesn't attack him. And fortunately, it does not. And what he thinks probably happened was when he picked up those elk antlers and put them on his backpack and was walking around with them, he probably attracted the mountain lion that thought he was an elk and therefore food. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle, into a rotating stage. And they put up partition walls all along to create 6 distinct stages. And so on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs songs about America. Debbie's job, she would go up before the very first act and she would greet the audience. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. She turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was this circular, fairly tall storage room. And the gap between the outside of the storage room and the back of any of these back walls was only a few inches. It was very narrow, but it was big enough that a person, in theory, could get stuck back there. After Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And she trips, which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the 2 back walls of the 2 stages she was on. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. And anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. These stages, they start to move because the show is going to start. When the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort and bones started to break. Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. And so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged, and she's still not dead. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff, and at that point they went for a look, and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. Around 1 p.m. on November 28, 1979, a 52-year-old tour guide named Peter Mulgrew stood at the front of the cabin of Air New Zealand flight TE901. Out the window next to him, he looked out and he saw this vast white landscape reflecting the afternoon sun. And so he grabbed the microphone and announced to the 237 passengers that they were now flying over Antarctica. The passengers got really excited and immediately pulled out their cameras and began snapping photos left and right. A lot of the passengers actually got up out of their seats and moved around to get the best angle of the ground down below. Now, on a normal commercial flight, that behavior would not be okay. But this was not a normal commercial flight. This was a sightseeing flight. Air New Zealand regularly took off from New Zealand and would fly people up over Antarctica, and their tour guide would point out a few landmarks down below, and then that flight would land back in New Zealand. That was the whole thing. Peter had been a tour guide for this flight many times before, and so after a couple of minutes, he called out to the passengers, "Hey, if you look out the left side of the plane, you'll get a great view of the coast of Antarctica." So all the passengers, they immediately get up, they're taking photos. And then a couple of minutes later, Peter called out to the group again and said, "Okay, now look out the right side where you'll see Mount Erebus." Then at the same time, the plane suddenly jolted hard, and one of those passengers on the right side took this photo. As you can see, there are black marks on the window, and these black marks are believed to be either engine oil or soot from Mount Erebus, because Mount Erebus was not just some mountain. Mount Erebus was an active volcano, and the flight path of TE901 was supposed to have them going safely around Mount Erebus to get a nice full view of the volcano. But mistakes were made, and before the pilots could correct them, the plane flew directly into the volcano. And so this photo you're looking at almost certainly was taken literally at the moment of impact, a crash that resulted in 237 lives lost. The crash of flight TE901 was the worst aviation disaster in New Zealand history, and as a result, Air New Zealand no longer offers those sightseeing flights. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is one of the most remarkable and beautiful places on Earth. Not only is it renowned for its biodiversity, it's also home to one of the world's so-called supervolcanoes. This supervolcano sits atop one of the world's largest magma bodies fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means the water bodies at the surface, the famous Yellowstone hot springs, are highly acidic and incredibly incredibly hot. If you were to ignore the countless warnings around these hot springs telling you to stay away, do not go in the hot springs, if you were to ignore those and go in one, or more accurately, fall in one, this is what would happen to you. First, your body would register that your skin was bathing in waters exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This would hurt like nothing you can possibly imagine, but it would only hurt as long as your nervous system was able to register pain, which would only be for about 1 minute or less. At this temperature, your skin would begin to quickly break down and disintegrate, and your blood vessels in your underlying dermis would rupture, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers would not break down, but they would lose all of their water and become tough and blacken. And your underlying subcutaneous fat would bubble off as well. All in all, this is known as a full thickness burn, and it would occur in about 1 minute in these waters. Your nervous system would enter a state of shock and become irreversibly damaged, which would lead to most, if not all, of your organs to fail if the heat stress has not already done that to you. You would be dead within 2 to 3 minutes, and then at that point, the acidity of the water would take over. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. And for anyone who falls in but manages to climb out again before being dissolved, they are not out of the woods. Many of those people, unfortunately, will die hours, days, months later due to complications from the burns. On June 7th, 2016, Colin Scott and his sister Sable went to Yellowstone to see the famous hot springs. The siblings were exploring the Norris Geyser Basin, which is the park's oldest and hottest thermal area, when they decided to leave the safety of the boardwalk and walk past all the signs telling them, do not leave the boardwalk, this is dangerous, turn around. They decided to walk past all of those and venture out off the course. They walked approximately 200 meters away from the path to the edge of a hot spring that was not really part of the main tour, and they were just standing there when Colin apparently tripped and fell into the hot spring. And his sister was just not able to do anything. She knew she couldn't go in after him, and he very quickly sunk below the surface and didn't come up again. She ran back to try to get help, but by the time they got back to the edge of the hot spring, he was gone. And in fact, the only thing they would find of Colin Scott was his flip-flops. Since 1890, Colin Scott, along with 21 other people, have died by falling into these hot springs. In 1974, Jean-Claude Romand enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend, and shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luc, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident. In the night, a boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. When Luc arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room. The policemen said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you?" And they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1970s, but he failed to show up for his first year exam, and so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years. All the while, he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies, and eventually he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would drive around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel, stay there for a couple of days, and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was a UN employee. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money, and he didn't have it. And they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization's staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And the way he handles it it is he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life. And so after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence. But in 2015, he became eligible for parole, and in 2019, he was released.
Do you believe in aliens?
For me, it just always felt like too arrogant to be like, it's just us.
It was Neil deGrasse Tyson who gave this example. Humans think that if there were alien life on Earth, that effectively we believe we could just simply identify it. But he was like, think of it this way. When you walk down the street and there is an ant on the ground, are you like, I want to get down there and talk to that ant?
Right.
No, you might step on the ant. You might not even notice the ant. Go even lower than that to like algae. Yeah. Are you looking to communicate with algae? No. What's to say that we are not equivalent to an ant or algae to other beings? Suggesting if there were higher beings on this planet, it's very arrogant to say, one, they'd be interested in us, or two, that we could even recognize them as anything close to what we are. Algae and humans couldn't be more different in terms of their makeup. And so it's like they could absolutely be here, but they're four-dimensional.
Imagine the aliens watching this clip and they're just like, look at these two fucking ants talking about the dumbest shit.
Two
ants. We don't want
ants.
to waste our time with these morons.
Dude.
At 6:30 p.m. on May 14th, 1955, a 24-year-old man named Donald Giroux stood next to his friend, 28-year-old Murray Anderson, on the shore of a natural spring in the state of Georgia. The spring was called Radium Springs because literally there was radium in the water. Radium is a naturally occurring, highly radioactive metallic element, but there were such low levels of it in the water that it wasn't really a hazard. However, it made it practically neon blue. Donald and Murray were both members of the U.S. Navy. In their off time, they were recreational scuba divers. Except, back in 1955, recreational scuba diving was totally not safe. You didn't really have access to good equipment. They had to literally make their own diving equipment. And so that's what made it really dangerous. There were sections in Radium Springs that nobody had mapped, and they were going to go down there and see it for themselves. They donned their amateur equipment and submerged. A few minutes later, Donald and Murray had traveled about 70 feet straight down the water column. Right in front of them was this huge entrance, and this was actually a well-known cavern. While the entrance to the cavern had been sort of mapped out and searched, there were all these little spidery offshoots that had not been explored. They had attached a dive line when they had gone into the spring. It's a 200-foot line, and they carried it with them. But once they were inside of this cavern, all the light completely went away. They had their flashlights, but there's all this silt that began getting kicked up. They could basically only see maybe 6 inches in front of them. They were about to go into this offshoot when Donald suddenly started seeing all these air bubbles coming up against him. There's only one place that an air bubble could be emerging from, and that's from his oxygen tank. Donald grabs Murray and just tries to shake him and sort of signal, hey, I got an issue here, but he had no way of knowing if Murray actually understood. And Donald turned around and held onto that dive line, followed it back up to the surface. He was actually able to fix the issue, and so before long, he had put his equipment back on, back in the water, and following the dive line back down towards the cavern. He just keeps going and going deeper and deeper into the system, and eventually he reaches the very end of the dive line, 200 feet at this point, and there's no Murray. He gets to the bottom of the cave, there's nothing there, he starts feeling the tunnels, there's nothing, and he's thinking, I need to get help immediately. He goes back to the surface, and he contacted authorities. 2 commercial divers, along with an entire U.S. Navy dive team, began looking for Murray until 8 a.m. the next morning. When Donald had that malfunction, Murray continued to spool out the dive line, and Murray got all the way to the end of the dive line, 200 feet. Somehow or another, Murray became disconnected from the dive line. And when Donald came back down and got to the end of that dive line and discovered Murray wasn't there, what he didn't know is that Murray actually was just a couple of feet away. He was basically right above him because that's where Murray was ultimately found. And so in Murray's final moments, he just scrambled around trying to find his way out again until he eventually drowned just feet away from his dive line, the very thing that would have brought him to safety. Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper. Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. There was a man sleeping in the front seat, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house. The next day he would leave. The couple went inside their house. Doug rounded up all the trash, and when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. Doug yells out to this guy, "What are you doing here?" The man put his hands up and said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. He happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house. He knew it was Kristen's house. It looked like nobody was home. So he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person, but by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. He asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't. Maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug said, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door, he pulled out a metal pipe and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Kristen came running down the stairs and she sees her husband who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Wayne drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. She does as she's told. And then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement, and then he savagely beat him with the pipe, pulled out a blade, and plunged it directly into Doug's chest. And then when he pulled it out, Doug slumped over. Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. Doug managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out. As Doug is making his way up, his wife screaming in the bedroom, he can hear the sound of footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim chest tight with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. Wayne came flying around the corner with Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards and Doug turned his rifle around like a baseball bat, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne. As Wayne continues to stumble and fall, and he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol. Then he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. Wayne drops the gun, and Doug sees that. He grabs the pistol and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up. Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. The police investigated Wayne Nance, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. The true number of people he killed is still unknown. There is still some debate about what exactly happened in this story that I'm about to share with you, and so for transparency, I am going to rely on the narrative that was presented in court by the defendant. On the afternoon of December 3rd, 2012, a freelance photographer working for the New York Post newspaper named Umar Abbasi was walking down the stairs of the 49th Street subway station in New York City, and he purchased a subway ticket, pushed past the turnstiles, and was now standing out on the actual train platform. And so Umar decides he's going to turn right and wait at the right end of the platform. At some point, he did pass 2 people that were engaged in a pretty heated conversation. So he walked past them, didn't give it much of a second thought. He starts to notice that those 2 men who had been bickering before are now straight up yelling at each other. These 2 guys are about 100 to 125 feet away from him when all of a sudden he hears a scream coming from the left side of the platform. He saw a woman pointing down at the train tracks, and he sees there is now a man, one of the 2 men who had been fighting, laying face down on the train tracks. He looks up and he sees the headlights of the train. It is now coming into the station. And so Umar starts running down the platform to try to get to this man. The man down on the tracks tries to stand up and he tries to pull himself up and out of the tracks, but he doesn't have the strength or the coordination. And as Umar is getting closer and closer, but he's still too far away to help, he sees that this guy down on the tracks is not going to be able to get out of there before the train hits him. And he watches as this man down on the tracks lets go of the lip of this platform and just turns and faces the train. And then seconds later, the train, although it did try to stop, impacted this man and killed him instantly. The man's name was Kai-Suk Han, and he was 58 years old. When the police finally showed up, they arrested the other man who Han had been fighting with. He was a 30-year-old named Naeem Davis, and Davis would actually tell police that he had pushed him onto the tracks, but it was in self-defense. However, that self-defense story didn't stop him from being charged with murder. While Davis sat in jail waiting for his trial, the media and the public at large had already come to the conclusion that Davis was guilty. And this was due in large part to a particular picture. Umar was also taking dozens and dozens of pictures, and those pictures were of Han right before he was struck by the train. He gave them to his employer, the New York Post newspaper, and the day after the incident, they ran on the front page with the headline, "Doomed." But as it would turn out, nearly 5 years later, when Davis did finally get his trial, he was acquitted of all charges because it turned out Han was very drunk and had picked a fight with Davis, and Davis was filmed on more than one occasion on the platform trying to get Han to leave him alone. After Han began making death threats and then grabbed Davis's shoulder, Davis turned around and pushed him, and Han, being drunk, stumbled and fell backwards onto the tracks and then was ultimately killed. Here is the infamous photo of Han on the cover of the New York Post newspaper. In 2010, an avid caver named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook to find the opening to the cave. It was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. So Jeff enters the cave, and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark, and he's about to make that final descent when he notices something out of the corner of his eye, and he focuses his light on the side of the shaft, and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. On the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear, and his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. Finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up, and he begins making his way back up, and the whole time he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off, takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there, he redresses and gets in the car. And he takes his notebook out, and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. And on top of it, he writes, "The Entrance to Hell."
10 a.m. on July 26th, 2015, a 31-year-old mom named Xiang Lu Xuan and her husband chased their 2-year-old son around a brand new indoor playground. This playground was on the 6th floor of a mall in Jingzhou City, which is in central China. Xiang caught up to her son and scooped him up and then placed him at the top of a slide. And he happily slid down to the bottom, and when he reached the bottom, Xiang was waiting for him, and the son, he just stopped and looked past her and pointed and started saying, "Ride, ride." And she saw right behind them were these 2 escalators. Her son clearly thought these escalators were maybe a part of this playground, and then told her husband they're going to go ride the ride, the escalators. Once Xiang and her son actually reached the escalator, suddenly her son was not as keen to hop on board. He was nervous, and eventually he stepped on right alongside her, holding her hand, and about halfway up the escalator, when she was confident her son would be okay, Xiang turned around and looked up towards the top of the escalator, and she saw 3 mall employees at the top of the escalator, and they were clearly looking at Xiang with a very serious look on their faces, and they were gesturing at something towards the top of the escalator. But the 3 mall employees just didn't do a good job communicating whatever was going on or whatever issue they were dealing with. And so as a result, Xiang and her son just continued riding up the escalator, and as they got closer and closer, these mall employees continued to gesture at something happening on the 7th floor just beyond the escalator, and Xiang still totally confused. And then finally, when Xiang and her son reached the top and stepped off, moments later, Xiang's husband, who was still down below on the 6th floor at the playground, he heard the sound of his wife and son screaming over near the escalator. And so instinctively, he bolted over to the escalator. He didn't see his wife, didn't see his son, and he began going up the escalator when someone at the top screamed at him to stop and get off the escalator. And so he did. And right then, a mall employee came running down the other side carrying his son. It would turn out earlier that day, those mall employees who were at the top gesturing to Xiang, they had discovered a defect with the metal platform that sits right at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor. But instead of immediately blocking off the escalator, these employees just kind of nonchalantly allowed the escalator to continue, stationed a couple of them at the top to make sure nobody, used the escalator, and then called for a repairman. But the repairman hadn't shown up and fixed this problem by the time Xiang and her son boarded the escalator. escalator. And so by the time she got to the top and stepped off the escalator, well, the defect with the platform is that it caved in with any weight. And so she fell into the escalator. Where the teeth of the escalator was rotating, she took her son and thrusted him to the employees, saving his life before she disappeared and died inside the inner workings of the escalator. 2 people were ultimately arrested in connection with Xiang's death, and the safety failures and the mall reportedly offered to pay some settlement to Xiang's family. However, the details of that settlement have not been made public.
In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. He admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. And Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tella. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tella. The aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, you'll still ascend to Tella. 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997, and Bo saw this as the trigger. The UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the 3rd group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo. They did the same cleanup as Group 2, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do.
This isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace. They're all nothing but containers that we've used and borrowed for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road, and it was just thick forest on both sides of the road. Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother. She notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. She says to her mom, "I think I just saw a little girl." Misty's mother, she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. And they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's going to be now. They both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest, and she was rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. They realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager. The girl did not acknowledge them. They drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no street lights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road road, but after traveling for several minutes and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back to wherever it was she came from. And they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. So Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. Still in the fetal position, she's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat and grabs the knob to roll down the window manually. And her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell and she's looking at her mom and she's like, what's happening? And finally, her mother just said she didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me. And they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later and they run inside. Misty's mom calls 911. She just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. There was never any trace of that girl. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before. His sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250 and attached to it was a single word note. It just said damages. Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother live. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. One of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window, and when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. He had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He could tell she was totally intoxicated, and the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head. He fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Casey went upstairs to his mother's room, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. Raised his rifle, fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the ring out. He fixed the jam in his gun. He turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad. And that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. She's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. Flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother. Casey just aimed and 2 and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. This is a screenshot of the actual post. It's extremely graphic, and it's since been removed from the social media platform. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all.
On the evening of July 2nd, 1993, a 49-year-old politician named Maslin Idris paced around the living room inside of his home, which was located in a suburb of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Tonight, in his home, he was going to have a very important meeting. Maslin was already a very successful politician. He was a state assemblyman, which is sort of like a state congressperson. But what he really coveted, the thing he wanted more than anything else in his political career, was to become the
state's Mentry Bazaar, which is sort of like being the state's governor. And that was going to be the central focus of the big meeting at his house that night. Late that night, he heard a knock on the door, and then he opened it up, and standing in the hallway is this unbelievably beautiful woman who's flanked by these two men that he didn't know. She had long dark hair, this huge smile. This woman's name was Mona Fandey. Back in the 1980s, she had released a pop music album that had been very popular all over Malaysia. Now, in the early 1990s, Mona was done singing, but she had launched this brand new second career post-music. Mona was a highly sought-after professional shaman. And so Maslin very excitedly welcomed Mona and the two men, who were her husband and her assistant, into his home. And Mona puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "Why don't you show my husband and my assistant where the space is that we're going to be doing this ritual tonight?" And he led them into this other room. And right away, the assistant, he began spreading flower petals all over the ground. And she told Maslin to lay down on his back in the middle of the room. She says, "Close your eyes and clear your mind. I want you to picture riches raining down from the sky on you." And so Maslin did that. He swore he could literally feel the gold and silver actually hitting his body. And at that point, when he was actually feeling something, is when the ritual was done. A little over a year later, the famous shaman, Mona Fandey, glided her way through a crowd of photographers on a street just outside of Kuala Lumpur. Mona was dressed to the nines. She had red lipstick on, her hair was all styled up. So it would turn out the ritual that she had performed on Maslin a year earlier had made Maslin incredibly famous. And in turn, it had made Mona even more famous than she already was. Except it's important to understand that Mona wasn't really famous as much as she was infamous. Because what she did to Maslin is she actually just ritualistically executed him. Maslin wasn't even her first victim. He was her 8th victim, at least as far as we know, and she just got caught after she killed Maslin. When Maslin was laying in that room and the ritual's going on, he had his eyes closed. Mona grabbed an axe and brought it down into the middle of his chest. So this ritual murder was designed to lead to somebody getting more power and more fame, except that person was not really Maslin, it was Mona. And so when Mona was walking past that crowd of paparazzi and they're all taking photos of her, that was actually her walking to her murder trial. Every day she would basically treat that walk as like her personal red carpet. And then ultimately she was sentenced to death, but she was totally unfazed. And then literally her final words as the noose is being put around her neck were, "I'll never die." On January 17th, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run, but Gary was not about to run. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. The guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair. Gary didn't put up a fight. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of the space. It was like this big curtain that was protecting something on the other side. He saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station, there was a police officer armed with a They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. And immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But he actually did not want that. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready. And then once everything was in place, poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so for hours, they sat there pitching different ideas, but nothing really felt right. He suddenly has this epiphany. He just randomly
randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore. 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. He remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. It literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words. Just do it. Dan's client, that small business, was Nike.
2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. First thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He found that he kind of loved the job. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. The next morning, when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented. He didn't really know where he was. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks. It wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not. So just to play it safe, she said, hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. The doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out. Eventually, he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. Finally, that night, he would fall asleep. The next morning when Larry got up, he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him. And so he spent the day hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally, that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, and he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. But it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face. Immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue because the visibility was so bad. The next day when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry and they're asking people in town if they've seen him and no one's seen Larry. After a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, we're just gonna have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket was out of business and it was about to get torn down. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, Larry's body comes tumbling out. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. It was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. He went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers that no one in the store can see. All the workers would kind of congregate up there, and when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. These huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. Eventually, he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently, there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer.
On the morning of September 12, 2007, 20-year-old Ashley Wallace was in her dorm room at Bryant and Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting ready for her very first day of classes. She heard a knock. So there were two police officers standing in the hallway. Ashley had experienced some pretty severe trauma. Her father had passed away when she was 13, a sudden heart attack, and then her mother had remarried, and her stepfather had sort of struggled with depression on and off. And not long after her biological father had suddenly died, her stepfather took his own life. But she just had this awful feeling when she saw these police officers. They told her that we exhumed your father. We think he was murdered. When these officers had finally left Ashley's room, Ashley ended up calling her mother. Her mother also had a sort of similar experience with police that day. Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, just told her daughter to come home, forget about classes, and she drove the hour back to her mom's place. Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just retreated to their mother's kitchen, and there they cried together and talked through this horrible situation. The mom was like, I'm getting a drink. Do any of you guys want a drink? Ashley said sure. So Stacy mixed some drinks for her and Ashley. Ashley, as well as a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, the level of hungover she was feeling felt disproportionate. Like she was really hungover despite a relatively small amount of alcohol. Ashley wills herself out of bed. She feels horrible, but she's driving back to the campus. She goes to her classes. Finally, at the end of the day, during her last class, Ashley began to sort of break out of this fog. She hopped right back in her car and drove right back to her mother's house. And just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom just sat in the kitchen and also having a few drinks. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, she was so hungover. First thing that hit her is, I don't know where I am. She was in a hospital room. There were just these two police officers sitting against the wall in her room. And they explained to her that she was very lucky that her mother had actually found her in her bed unresponsive. One of them pulled a piece of paper out of their pocket. It would turn out the way Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life was by drinking antifreeze. At least that was the initial theory. As suspicions rose around the stepfather, investigators thought the biological father died just a few years before. They exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. Fast forward to the hospital. These officers have walked over to her, they've handed her a note, and this note was effectively a confession. The writer of this note said they killed Ashley's biological father, and then they also killed Ashley's stepfather. Because of the blood on their hands, they're going to take their own lives. It was signed by Ashley. Except Ashley did not kill her father or stepfather. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men, and then when police began poking around, she tried to poison her own daughter. Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little bit too early the following day. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders, as well as the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison.
John and Jackie Nill were a Canadian married couple that loved traveling to Thailand. In 2004, instead of spending Christmas with their family back home in Canada, they decided, you know what, we're empty nesters, we're on our own, let's go spend Christmas in a place that we love that's also warm. And so they settled on one of their favorite spots in Thailand called Khao Lak. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the couple woke up and decided to head down to the beach to spend the day lounging on the sand. But as soon as they stepped out of their villa and looked down at the beach, which was right outside of where they were staying, they saw this huge crowd of people standing on the sand. And even though it was early in the morning, John and Jackie knew immediately why they were down there. It was an extremely low tide. The water had receded so far that it was a spectacle. And so they had their digital camera with them and they just started taking pictures. What John and Jackie and the people down on the beach seem not to have realized is that that extreme low tide is actually an early indication of a tsunami tidal wave, where the water basically gets sucked way out in preparation for a massive wave. What John and Jackie and everybody down on that beach should have been doing that morning is turning around and running inland as far as they possibly can go and as high as they possibly can go. But they don't do that. In fact, it looks like no one has any idea what's about to happen. And so John and Jackie continue to take pictures, and you see this massive wave coming closer and closer with every picture they're taking until it wipes out everybody down on the beach and eventually wipes out John and Jackie. They would be swept away to their death along with 230,000 other people. John and Jackie's camera would be found on the beach a month later. The camera itself was destroyed, but the SIM card was intact. And the person who found it would take that SIM card, plug it into their computer, and here are the final pictures that were on that SIM card.